Have you ever felt like your entire existence was up for debate? Like every single choice you made, every breath you took, every dream you dared to whisper into the universe was somehow subject to approval by people who claim to love you? Well, let me tell you something that took me 32 years to understand. 32 years of suffocating under the weight of expectations and judgments and unsolicited opinions that chipped away at my soul piece by piece until I barely recognized the person staring back at me in the mirror. I grew up in a family where love came with conditions, where acceptance was something you had to earn through conformity, where being yourself was considered selfish and setting boundaries was seen as a declaration of war. For most of my life, I believed this was normal. I thought everyone lived with that constant knot in their stomach, that persistent voice in their head questioning every decision, that exhausting need to justify their choices to people who would never truly understand. I was wrong. So devastatingly, heartbreakingly wrong. And the journey to realizing that, to finally learning how to look my family in the eye and say those 5 words that would change everything, "That's not your business," nearly destroyed me before it could save me. This is my story. And if you've ever felt like you're living your life for everyone except yourself, if you've ever swallowed your truth to keep the peace, if you've ever wondered whether you're the problem or if maybe, just maybe, the people who claim to want the best for you are actually holding you back, then I need you to stay with me through every word of this journey, because what I'm about to share might just be the permission you've been waiting for to finally set yourself free. My earliest memories are painted with criticism. I remember being 5 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with my mother hovering over me, her face twisted in that expression I would come to know so well, that mixture of disappointment and concern that somehow always felt more like contempt than care. I was coloring a picture for her, a drawing of our family holding hands under a sunshine that I'd made bright yellow with orange rays stretching across the construction paper, like fingers reaching for something beautiful. I was so proud of it. I remember the way my heart swelled in my small chest as I prepared to show it to her, the anticipation bubbling up inside me like champagne ready to overflow. But when I held it up, her first words weren't about the love I'd poured into every crayon stroke. They were about how I'd colored outside the lines, how the proportions were all wrong, how my father's head was too big, and my little sister's dress was the wrong shade of pink. She didn't mean to be cruel. At least that's what I told myself for decades afterward. She was just trying to help me improve, to push me toward perfection, to prepare me for a world that wouldn't be kind to mediocrity. But what she actually did was plant a seed deep in my consciousness, a seed that would grow into a thorny vine wrapping itself around every ounce of confidence I tried to cultivate. That seed whispered a simple but devastating message. You are not good enough as you are. Everything you do needs correction. Your natural instincts are wrong. Your authentic self is something to be fixed. And so I learned, very early on, that love in my family was conditional on improvement, on meeting standards that shifted like sand beneath my feet, on becoming whoever they needed me to be in any given moment, rather than discovering who I actually was beneath all those layers of expectation and judgment and criticism disguised as concern. As I grew older, the criticism evolved but never diminished. It followed me through elementary school, where my mother would critique my choice of friends, telling me that Jenny was too bossy and would make me weak, that Marcus was too quiet and would hold me back, that I needed to surround myself with people who reflected the version of me she wanted to see, rather than people who actually made me happy. It shadowed me through middle school, where my father would sit at the dinner table, interrogating me about my grades, never celebrating the A's, but always dissecting the occasional B with the intensity of a prosecutor building a case, asking what went wrong, where I failed to study hard enough, why I wasn't applying myself, as if my worth as a human being could be calculated by the letters printed on a report card. It stalked me through high school, where every outfit I chose was too provocative or too frumpy. Every hobby I pursued was either a waste of time or not prestigious enough. Every career aspiration I voiced was met with concern about practicality, or warnings about disappointment, or suggestions that maybe I should consider something more suitable, more acceptable, more aligned with what they had envisioned for their daughter. And here's the thing that really twisted the knife. They always framed it as love. They were just trying to protect me from making mistakes. They were only looking out for my best interests. They had more life experience and knew better than I did what would make me happy. They were my family. And family tells you the truth even when it hurts, because they care about you too much to let you stumble through life making avoidable errors. That narrative was so deeply embedded in my understanding of our relationships that I never questioned it. I never stopped to ask whether protection had crossed the line into control, whether guidance had morphed into manipulation. whether their version of my best interest had anything at all to do with my actual needs, desires, and dreams. The pattern continued into adulthood with a persistence that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so suffocating. I remember the day I told them I was moving out of state for a job opportunity. I was 24 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing and an offer from a company in Seattle that felt like the beginning of everything I'd been working toward. I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, my hands shaking as I sat in the living room where I'd spent countless hours absorbing their opinions about my life and prepared to share what I thought would be good news. My mother's face fell immediately, that familiar expression settling over her features like a storm cloud blocking out the sun. My father set down his newspaper with deliberate slowness, the rustle of pages filling the silence that stretched between my announcement and their response. When they finally spoke, it wasn't with congratulations or excitement or even neutral acknowledgement of my achievement. It was with a barrage of concerns, objections, and thinly veiled accusations. Seattle was too far away. I didn't know anyone there. What if something happened and they needed to reach me? Had I really thought this through? Was I running away from something? From them? This company probably wasn't as stable as I thought. Did I really want to risk my career on an unknown entity in an unfamiliar city? And what about dating, marriage, family? How was I supposed to meet a good man when I was isolated on the other side of the country, surrounded by strangers who didn't share our values? Each question landed like a punch. Each concern felt like a chain wrapping around my ankles, pulling me back down into the quicksand of their expectations. And despite the voice in my head screaming that this was my life, my choice, my opportunity, I found myself defending my decision with increasing desperation, trying to convince them that I hadn't lost my mind, that I wasn't abandoning them, that I was still the good daughter they'd raised even as I dared to want something they hadn't pre-approved. I went to Seattle, but I carried their disapproval with me like luggage I couldn't set down. Every phone call home became an interrogation about whether I was eating properly, sleeping enough, making responsible choices, saving money, going to church, meeting the right people. Every visit back felt like a performance review where I had to justify not just my professional success, but my entire existence. They criticized the apartment I chose, saying it was in a neighborhood that seemed unsafe even though they'd never visited. They questioned my coworkers, asking probing questions about their backgrounds and intentions as if everyone I encountered was a potential threat to my well-being or their influence over me. They made pointed comments about my appearance, noting that I'd gained weight, or that my hair looked better when I wore it a certain way, or that the clothes I'd started wearing reflected a lifestyle they didn't recognize. And the romantic relationships, oh God, the romantic relationships were perhaps the worst battlefield of all. I dated a musician for 6 months, a beautiful soul named Derek, who wrote songs that made my heart ache in the best possible way, and who treated me like I was something precious and valuable exactly as I was. But to my family, he was a red flag wrapped in irresponsibility. He didn't have a stable career. He didn't own a home. He had tattoos. He came from a broken family. What kind of future could I possibly have with someone like that? The criticism was relentless, wearing me down until I started seeing Derek through their eyes instead of my own, until the magic that had drawn me to him became tainted with doubt and fear, and the persistent question of whether I was making a terrible mistake. We broke up eventually, not because we didn't love each other, but because I didn't have the strength to love him in the face of my family's rejection. And when I told my mother we'd ended things, do you know what she said? She said she was relieved, that she'd been praying I would come to my senses, that she knew I would eventually see what they saw. She said it like it was a victory, like my heartbreak was something to celebrate because I'd finally made the right choice, their choice, the choice that kept me safely within the boundaries of their approval. But something shifted after Derek. Something small and quiet and almost imperceptible at first, like the first crack in a dam that's been holding back an ocean of water. I started noticing the weight I was carrying, the constant tension in my shoulders, the way my stomach would clench whenever my phone rang with my mother's ringtone, the exhaustion that came from constantly editing myself and my life to fit their narrative. I started paying attention to my friends and coworkers, watching how they talked about their families with warmth and ease, how they shared news without bracing for criticism, how they made decisions based on their own values and desires rather than constant calculations about what would be acceptable to people who weren't living their lives. And I started asking myself dangerous questions, the kind of questions that once planted in your mind grow roots that crack through concrete and push up toward the light no matter how much you try to ignore them. Why did I need their permission to live my life? Why did their comfort matter more than my happiness? Why was I still, at 29 years old, seeking approval from people who seemed fundamentally unable or unwilling to give it. Who would I be if I stopped trying to be the daughter they wanted and started being the woman I actually was? The questions terrified me because I knew that finding the answers would require a kind of courage I wasn't sure I possessed, a willingness to risk the only family I had for the possibility of peace, authenticity, and self-respect. But the questions persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day, each critical phone call, each visit home that left me feeling smaller and less certain of my own worth. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I remember the date precisely because it was my 30th birthday, and I'd made the mistake of thinking that maybe, just maybe, this milestone would be different, that my family would celebrate me rather than critique me, that for one day I could just be loved without conditions or corrections or concerns. I'd been dating someone new, a woman named Alex who worked as an environmental lawyer and who made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years, who saw me clearly and liked what she saw, who never made me feel like I needed to be anything other than exactly who I was. I hadn't told my family about her yet because I knew what was coming. I knew how they felt about my sexuality, how they'd responded when I'd tried to come out to them in college with a carefully rehearsed speech that they'd dismissed as confusion or experimentation, or the result of spending too much time with the wrong influences. They'd made it clear that certain aspects of my identity were not acceptable topics of conversation, that some truths were better left unspoken, that their love extended only as far as the version of me that fit comfortably within their worldview. But Alex had encouraged me to be honest with them, not for their sake, but for mine, to stop living in the shadows of my own life, to claim my truth even if they rejected it. So on my birthday, when my mother called to wish me well and asked if I was seeing anyone special, I took a breath that felt like diving off a cliff and told her yes. I was dating someone wonderful, someone who made me happy, and her name was Alex. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the tears, the accusations, the declarations that I was breaking her heart, that this was a choice I was making to hurt them, that this lifestyle wasn't who I really was, that I needed to get help, that they hadn't raised me to be this way, that I was throwing away my chance at a normal family and a blessed life. My father got on the phone and his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before, telling me that if I insisted on this path, if I refused to see reason, then I was choosing to distance myself from the family, that actions have consequences, that they loved me but they couldn't support me in this sin. And then my mother's voice again, broken and pleading, asking how I could do this to them on my birthday of all days, how I could ruin what should have been a happy conversation, why I always had to make everything so difficult and dramatic and painful. I sat on my couch after that call ended, phone still clutched in my trembling hand, tears streaming down my face, and felt something inside me finally shatter. Not break, shatter. Like a mirror hit with a hammer, pieces flying in all directions. The reflection I'd been trying so hard to maintain suddenly impossible to reconstruct. And in the wreckage of that moment, in the space where my desperate need for their approval had lived for 3 decades, something new began to emerge. It was rage, yes, white-hot and justified, but it was also clarity. Crystal clear, undeniable clarity about what had been happening to me my entire life. They didn't love me. They loved the idea of who they wanted me to be. They didn't care about my happiness. They cared about their comfort, their reputation, their ability to tell themselves they were good parents raising a good daughter who made good choices that they could approve of. And I had been complicit in this dynamic, sacrificing pieces of myself year after year, relationship after relationship, dream after dream, all in service of maintaining a connection that was fundamentally one-sided, conditional, and ultimately toxic. I had been so afraid of losing them that I'd been losing myself instead, trading my authenticity for their acceptance, my joy for their peace of mind, my truth for their approval. And suddenly, sitting there on my 30th birthday with mascara streaking down my cheeks and my heart breaking open in a way that felt both devastating and strangely liberating, I realized that I couldn't do it anymore. I physically, emotionally, spiritually could not continue to live this way. Something had to change, and that something was me. Have you ever reached a point where you knew with absolute certainty that you were at a crossroads? That the decision you made in that moment would determine the entire trajectory of the rest of your life? That's where I was, and I was terrified. The decision to set boundaries wasn't sudden or simple. It unfolded over the next several weeks in a series of small acts of courage that felt monumental to someone who'd spent her entire life accommodating others. I started with the smallest possible step, which was not immediately calling my mother back when she left her daily voicemails checking in on me, offering unsolicited advice, or expressing concern about my silence. That first unreturned phone call felt like rebellion and freedom and guilt all swirled together in a cocktail that made me nauseous with anxiety. I kept expecting some catastrophic consequence, some punishment for my defiance, but nothing happened except that I got to spend that evening in peace, cooking dinner with Alex, laughing about something ridiculous, existing in my own life without commentary or correction or concern. The next step was harder. My mother sent a text asking if I was coming home for Thanksgiving, and instead of automatically saying yes like I had every year of my adult life, I wrote back that I was making other plans. The response was immediate and intense. Phone calls, texts from my father, messages from my sister asking what was wrong, why I was acting so strange. Didn't I care about family traditions? Was I really going to miss Thanksgiving because of some phase I was going through? The pressure was immense, designed to make me fold, to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy, to punish me for the audacity of prioritizing my own needs. But I held firm. I spent Thanksgiving with Alex and her family, people who asked me questions about my life because they were genuinely interested in my answers, who laughed at my jokes, who didn't monitor my food choices or comment on my appearance, who treated me like a fully formed adult capable of making my own decisions. It was the best Thanksgiving I'd ever had, and that realization filled me with equal parts joy and grief because it meant acknowledging just how much I'd been missing, how hollow those family gatherings had always been beneath the facade of togetherness. Setting boundaries became my practice, my discipline, my daily act of self-preservation. When my mother called to criticize my career choices, I said, "That's not your business." And the words felt foreign and powerful in my mouth like a spell I was learning to cast. When my father sent an email outlining all the ways I was disappointing them, I didn't respond with justifications or apologies. I simply wrote back, "I'm living my life according to my own values. I hope you can respect that." When my sister tried to guilt me into attending a family event by saying I was tearing the family apart, I told her gently but firmly that I was not responsible for managing their emotions or maintaining relationships that required me to be someone I wasn't. Each boundary I set felt like removing a brick from a wall that had been built around me since childhood. And with each brick removed, I could breathe a little easier, stand a little taller, see a little further into the possibility of who I might become without their constant surveillance and judgment. But I won't lie to you and pretend it was easy or painless, or that I didn't spend many nights crying into Alex's shoulder, questioning whether I was being selfish, wondering if I was throwing away my family over nothing, fearing that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The guilt was crushing at times, this heavy thing pressing down on my chest, telling me I was a bad daughter, an ungrateful child, someone who should be ashamed of choosing herself over the people who raised her. The programming ran deep. Those decades of conditioning that taught me my role was to accommodate, to comply, to contort myself into whatever shape they needed me to be. Undoing that programming required constant vigilance, constant recommitment to my own worth, constant reminders that I deserved to exist on my own terms. The family dynamics shifted in ways both predictable and surprising. My mother oscillated between anger and manipulation, sometimes calling me selfish and dramatic, other times crying about how much she missed me, how I was breaking her heart. Couldn't I just come back and be the daughter she remembered? My father withdrew almost entirely, communicating only through my mother or my sister, making it clear through his silence that I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My sister became the mediator, the peacekeeper, the one trying to fix what she saw as a rift that I had created through my unreasonableness. She would call me in tears, begging me to just apologize, to just compromise, to just come to one dinner and smooth things over because didn't I understand how hard this was on everyone? How uncomfortable the family gatherings had become without me there to absorb the tension. And that phrase, absorb the tension, was what finally made me understand my role in the family system. I had been the emotional shock absorber, the one who took on everyone's anxiety and criticism and dysfunction so that the rest of them could maintain the illusion of normalcy. I was the designated problem, the scapegoat, the one whose struggles and failures and differences allowed them to feel better about themselves, to bond over their shared concern for me, to avoid looking at their own issues by focusing all their attention on fixing mine. Removing myself from that role didn't just affect me. It destabilized the entire system, forcing everyone to confront dynamics they'd preferred to keep hidden, to find new ways of relating that didn't rely on my compliance and self-sacrifice. Some of them couldn't do it. Some of them didn't want to. And I had to make peace with the fact that choosing myself meant accepting their choice to reject the version of me that refused to play my assigned part anymore. The emotional cost of maintaining my boundaries was higher than I'd anticipated. There were holidays I spent with friends instead of family, knowing my mother was probably crying to relatives about how I'd abandoned them, painting herself as the victim of my selfishness. There were birthdays that passed without phone calls or cards, silences that spoke volumes about how conditional their love had always been. There were moments of profound loneliness when I would see happy families in movies or on social media and feel the ache of what I'd never had and now never would have. That fairy tale version of family where people support each other unconditionally, celebrate each other's differences, and prioritize relationship over control. I grieved for the family I'd always wanted and never had. I grieved for the little girl I'd been, who'd colored that picture with so much love and hope, who'd believed that if she just tried hard enough, was good enough, changed enough, she would finally earn the acceptance she craved. I grieved for all the years I'd wasted trying to be someone I wasn't, all the relationships I'd sabotaged because I viewed them through the lens of my family's judgment, all the dreams I'd deferred because they didn't fit the approved narrative. The grief was real and necessary and at times overwhelming. But alongside the grief, something else was growing. It was peace. It was authenticity. It was the radical experience of living in alignment with my own values, making choices based on what I wanted, rather than what would minimize criticism, showing up in the world as my full, messy, complicated, beautiful self without apology or explanation. I was building a life that felt like mine, surrounding myself with people who loved me because of who I was, rather than despite it, pursuing dreams that excited me, rather than ones that seemed safe or acceptable. And for the first time in my 30 years on this planet, I was starting to like the person I was becoming. Building resilience became essential to my survival and growth. I found a therapist who specialized in family systems and trauma, someone who helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just normal family conflict, but a pattern of emotional abuse disguised as love and concern. That reframing was both devastating and liberating because it meant acknowledging that my family had harmed me, but it also meant understanding that I hadn't been crazy or oversensitive or dramatic like they'd always suggested. My responses had been completely appropriate to an inappropriate situation. I started attending support groups for adult children of narcissistic families, sitting in circles with strangers who became friends as we shared stories that were eerily similar despite the different details. I wasn't alone. There were thousands, maybe millions of people who'd grown up in families where love came with conditions, where criticism was disguised as care, where setting boundaries was treated like betrayal. Hearing their stories validated my experience in ways I desperately needed. I dove into books about codependency, enmeshment, and healthy relationships, educating myself about what normal actually looked like because my baseline had been so skewed that I had no framework for understanding functional family dynamics. I learned about differentiation, the process of developing a solid sense of self that isn't dependent on the approval or validation of others. I learned about triangulation, how family members recruit others to side with them against you, exactly what my sister had been doing when she called crying about family gatherings. I learned about DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender, the pattern where abusers portray themselves as the victims when held accountable, exactly what my mother had been doing when she cried about how much I was hurting her by setting boundaries. The education was painful because it meant naming what had happened to me, calling it what it was, but it was also empowering because knowledge is power, and understanding the dynamics gave me tools to resist the manipulation and guilt that my family deployed with precision whenever I dared to prioritize my own well-being. Alex became my anchor during this time, this incredible woman who loved me fiercely and without reservation, who never asked me to be anything other than exactly who I was, who celebrated my weirdness and my vulnerability and my growing strength. She held me when I cried, challenged me when I slipped back into old patterns of self-doubt and guilt, reminded me daily that I was worthy of love that didn't require me to shrink or hide or change. We built a relationship based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine care for each other's well-being. It was so different from anything I'd known growing up that sometimes I would just sit and marvel at how peaceful it felt to be with someone who didn't criticize or control or demand that I live my life according to their specifications. Alex's family welcomed me with open arms, not because they agreed with everything I did or thought I was perfect, but because they cared about their daughter's happiness and could see that I made her happy. They asked me questions about my work, my interests, my dreams. They made space for me at their table without demanding I earn my seat through performance or compliance. They disagreed with me sometimes about politics or movies or the best way to make pasta sauce, but those disagreements never felt like attacks on my fundamental worth as a human being. They were just differences of opinion between people who respected each other enough to allow for different perspectives. Experiencing that kind of healthy family dynamic was simultaneously healing and heartbreaking because it showed me with crystal clarity what I'd been missing, what I'd thought was normal but absolutely wasn't, what I deserved but had never believed I could have. The confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure came about 18 months after my birthday breakdown. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced, having gotten my address from my sister, who'd apparently decided that ambushing me was an appropriate problem-solving strategy. I opened the door to find her standing there with red-rimmed eyes and that expression I knew so well. That mixture of hurt and determination and righteous anger that she wore like armor whenever she felt her control slipping. She pushed past me into my living room before I could decide whether to invite her in or close the door, and I felt that old familiar response rising in my chest, that urge to apologize for existing, to make her comfortable, to manage her emotions at the expense of my own. But I breathed through it, grounded myself in the life I'd built, the person I'd become, the boundaries I'd fought so hard to establish, and I stayed standing rather than shrinking. She launched immediately into her prepared speech, voice trembling with emotion that I couldn't tell was genuine or performed. She talked about how much I'd hurt her, how I'd abandoned the family, how I'd chosen strangers and this lifestyle over the people who loved me most, how she'd spent sleepless nights worrying about my soul and my future and my happiness. She said I used to be so sweet, so easy, so loving, and she didn't understand what had happened to me, why I'd become so cold and selfish and unwilling to accept guidance from people who only wanted what was best for me. She said that families work through their problems together, that you don't just walk away when things get hard, that I was throwing away decades of relationship over minor disagreements and misunderstandings. She said I was being manipulated by Alex, that I couldn't see clearly because I was in too deep with someone who was leading me away from my values and my family. She said all of this without pausing for breath, without asking me a single question about my perspective or my experience, without any genuine curiosity about why I'd made the choices I'd made. It was a monologue, not a conversation. A performance designed to make me feel guilty enough to come back into line, to resume my role as the compliant daughter who absorbed everyone's dysfunction so they didn't have to deal with it themselves. When she finally stopped talking, silence filled the room like water flooding a sinking ship. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for my apology, my reassurance, my capitulation to her demands disguised as maternal concern. And I felt something shift inside me, something clicking into place like a key turning in a lock. I looked at this woman who'd given birth to me, who'd raised me, who'd shaped so much of who I'd become, and I felt compassion for her pain but not responsibility for fixing it. I felt sadness for the relationship we'd never had and never would have, but not guilt for establishing boundaries that protected my well-being. I felt love for her because she was my mother, but not at the expense of loving myself. And from that place of clarity and groundedness and hard-won self-respect, I spoke my truth. I told her that I understood she was hurt, but that her hurt didn't obligate me to return to a dynamic that was harmful to me. I told her that I hadn't abandoned the family, but rather chosen to engage with them only in ways that were healthy and sustainable for me. I told her that my relationship with Alex wasn't a lifestyle or a phase, but simply me being honest about who I'd always been, and that her rejection of my sexuality was her choice, but not one I was willing to let define my life anymore. I told her that I loved her, but that love didn't mean accepting criticism, control, and conditions as the price of connection. And then I said the words that had been building in me for 18 months, the words that represented everything I'd learned and every boundary I'd established, and every ounce of courage I'd cultivated. I looked her in the eye and said, how I live my life, who I love, what career I choose, where I live, what I believe, how I spend my time, that's not your business anymore. I'm a grown woman, and I get to make my own choices even if you don't like them, or understand them, or approve of them. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm simply informing you of my reality. And if you can't respect that, if you can't love me without trying to control me, then we don't have a relationship worth preserving. The aftermath of that confrontation was both liberating and devastating. My mother left my apartment in tears, telling me I'd regret this, that I was making a choice I couldn't take back, that family was forever and I was throwing it away over my own stubborn pride. She didn't call for 3 months after that. Neither did my father. My sister sent a few texts calling me cruel and selfish for being so harsh with our mother, saying I'd gone too far, that there were ways to set boundaries without being so hurtful. But here's what they didn't understand, what they refused to understand. I hadn't been harsh. I'd been honest. For the first time in my entire life, I'd spoken my truth without softening it or packaging it in ways designed to make it more palatable to people who didn't want to hear it. I'd stated simple facts about my right to live my own life, and the fact that those statements felt harsh to them revealed everything about how accustomed they'd become to my compliance, how much they'd relied on my willingness to absorb criticism without pushing back, how fundamentally our relationships had been built on inequality and control. The silence from my family was painful, but also clarifying. It showed me that they'd rather have no relationship with me than a relationship where they couldn't control me. It proved that their love had always been conditional, contingent on my willingness to meet their expectations and suppress my authentic self. And while that knowledge hurt like hell, it also freed me from the last vestiges of hope that if I just tried hard enough, explained myself well enough, loved them consistently enough, they would eventually accept me. They wouldn't. They couldn't. Not because of any failing on my part, but because they were unwilling or unable to see me as a separate person with my own autonomy, dreams, and right to self-determination. Accepting that reality allowed me to finally stop fighting for their approval and start fully investing in my own life, my own happiness, my own chosen family of friends and partners who loved me for who I actually was. As months turned into a year and then beyond, I built a life that felt authentically mine in ways I'd never experienced before. I got promoted at work because I was finally performing at my full capacity instead of being distracted by family drama and weighed down by their criticism. Alex and I moved in together, creating a home that reflected both of us, filling it with art and music and laughter and the kind of easy affection that comes from being seen and accepted. I developed deeper friendships with people who respected my boundaries, who celebrated my growth, who didn't expect me to shrink myself to make them comfortable. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to see but had avoided because my family would have criticized the expense or the risk or the frivolousness of it. I tried new hobbies, explored new interests, discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for decades under the weight of other people's expectations. I started writing again, something I'd loved as a teenager, but had abandoned when my father told me it wasn't a practical skill, that I should focus on more marketable talents. I volunteered with an LGBTQ youth organization, using my story to help younger people who were struggling with family rejection, trying to be the support for them that I'd never had at their age. I went back to school part-time to get a master's degree in something I was passionate about rather than something that would impress my parents. I made choices daily, hourly, moment by moment, to prioritize my own well-being, to honor my own needs, to trust my own judgment. And with each choice, I became more solid, more grounded, more certain of who I was and what I deserved. The guilt didn't disappear entirely, it probably never will, but it became manageable, a whisper rather than a scream, something I could acknowledge and then set aside rather than something that controlled my every decision. I learned to distinguish between healthy guilt that signals you've actually done something wrong and toxic guilt that's been programmed into you as a control mechanism. Most of the guilt I felt about my family fell into the latter category, and recognizing that allowed me to release it without shame. Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Maybe not with family, but with friends or partners or colleagues who tried to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries, for choosing yourself, for refusing to accept treatment that diminished your worth? If so, I want you to know that you're not alone, and more importantly, you're not wrong. Setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish. Saying no doesn't make you cruel. Choosing your own well-being doesn't make you a bad person. We've been conditioned to believe that we owe people access to us, compliance with their expectations, patience with their dysfunction, especially when those people are family. But we don't. We really, truly don't. You have permission to protect yourself, to prioritize your peace, to remove yourself from relationships that require you to be someone you're not. And yes, there will be consequences. People will be upset. They'll call you selfish or dramatic or difficult. They'll tell you that you've changed, that you're not the person they thought you were, that you're throwing away good relationships over nothing. Let them. Let them be upset. Let them call you names. Let them rewrite history to make themselves the victims of your growth. None of that changes the truth, which is that you deserve to live authentically, to be loved without conditions, to make choices based on your own values rather than someone else's comfort. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries even when they don't fully understand them. The people who can't respect your boundaries are showing you that their relationship with you was never really about you at all, but rather about what they could get from you, how you made them feel, whether you were willing to play the role they'd assigned you in their life story. Looking back now from the vantage point of someone who's been living with strong boundaries for several years, I can see with clarity how transformative this journey has been. I'm not the same person I was when I sat on that couch on my 30th birthday, sobbing after that devastating phone call with my parents. That version of me was scared, uncertain, still clinging to the hope that if I could just explain myself better, or love them harder, or change in the right ways, I could have both my authentic self and my family's approval. But you can't have both when the family's approval requires you to deny your authentic self. You have to choose. And I chose me. I chose truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, peace over performance. And it was the hardest and best decision I've ever made. My relationship with my family today is minimal and strictly on my terms. My mother and I exchange emails occasionally, surface-level updates about health and weather, and nothing that matters. My father and I haven't spoken directly in over 2 years. My sister and I have coffee a few times a year, conversations that are pleasant but distant, both of us avoiding topics that might crack the fragile detente we've established. It's not the relationship I wanted or hoped for, but it's the relationship that's possible given their unwillingness to see me as I actually am, and I've made peace with that. I've grieved the fantasy family I wanted and accepted the reality of the family I have, and I've built a chosen family that fills my life with love and support and acceptance in ways my biological family never could. Alex is now my wife, and we're talking about starting a family of our own, one where our children will be celebrated for who they are rather than criticized for who they're not, where differences will be honored rather than attacked, where love will be unconditional rather than contingent on compliance. The work of maintaining boundaries is ongoing. It's not something you do once, and then it's done. It's a practice, a daily recommitment to your own worth, a constant vigilance against the old patterns that want to reassert themselves whenever you're tired or stressed or vulnerable. There are still moments when my phone rings with my mother's number, and my stomach clenches with that old familiar anxiety. There are still holidays when I feel the pull of obligation, the whisper that maybe I should just go back, just make peace, just try one more time to make it work. There are still days when the guilt rises up and tries to convince me that I'm a terrible daughter, that I should be ashamed of myself, that I'm destroying my family through my selfishness. But I've learned to recognize those voices for what they are, echoes of old programming, ghosts of conditioning that no longer serves me, and I've learned to respond with compassion for myself and firmness in my boundaries. I remind myself of how far I've come, how much healthier and happier I am, how much more alive I feel when I'm living according to my own values rather than trying to meet impossible standards set by people who will never be satisfied. I remind myself that I'm not responsible for managing other people's emotions, that their discomfort with my boundaries is information about them rather than an indictment of me, that I can love them from a distance while still protecting my peace. And most importantly, I remind myself that I deserve to take up space in the world, to have opinions and preferences and dreams that might differ from what others want for me, to be loved for who I am rather than who someone else needs me to be. If you're reading this and seeing yourself in my story, if you're recognizing patterns in your own family or relationships that feel similar to what I've described, I want to encourage you to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If you constantly feel anxious or inadequate or criticized in certain relationships, that's information worth paying attention to. You don't have to keep accepting treatment that hurts you just because it's coming from family or people who claim to love you. Love shouldn't hurt. Love shouldn't require you to shrink or hide or constantly defend your choices. Real love celebrates you, supports you, respects your autonomy, and honors your right to live your own life, even when it doesn't align perfectly with what others might want for you. Setting boundaries isn't easy, especially when you've been conditioned your whole life to prioritize other people's comfort over your own well-being. It takes courage and practice and a willingness to sit with discomfort as you reprogram decades of conditioning. But it's worth it. It's so profoundly, life-changingly worth it. On the other side of those boundaries is a life that feels authentic, peaceful, and genuinely yours. On the other side is the possibility of relationships built on mutual respect rather than control and compliance. On the other side is the radical experience of liking yourself, of trusting your own judgment, of knowing that you're worthy of love that doesn't come with conditions or criticism or constant surveillance. I'm not going to tell you it'll be easy or that everyone will understand or that you won't lose relationships in the process, but I will tell you that what you gain, your sense of self, your peace of mind, your authentic life, is worth more than what you'll lose, which when you really examine it was never truly yours to begin with. I want to take a moment to talk directly to those of you who might be struggling with this right now, who might be at that crossroads I was at on my 30th birthday, trying to decide whether to keep accepting unacceptable treatment or to risk everything for the possibility of freedom and authenticity. I see you. I understand the fear that keeps you frozen, the guilt that tells you you're being selfish, the hope that maybe if you just try harder or wait longer or love better, things will change. I understand the grief of accepting that the family you wanted is not the family you have, that the love you deserved was not the love you received, that the acceptance you craved may never come no matter how much you change or compromise or shrink yourself. I understand how lonely it feels to choose yourself when everyone around you is telling you you're wrong, selfish, dramatic, too sensitive, not trying hard enough. I understand all of it because I lived all of it, and I'm here to tell you that you can survive this. You can do hard things. You can say no to people you love without being a bad person. You can establish boundaries even when others react badly. You can build a life that honors your truth even if it costs you relationships you hoped would last forever. And not only can you survive it, you can thrive in ways you never imagined possible when you were still contorting yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold the fullness of who you are. Your life is yours to live. Not your parents, not your siblings, not your extended families. Yours. And you get to make choices about who you are, how you live, what you believe, who you love, what dreams you pursue. You get to say, that's not your business, to anyone who tries to control or criticize or diminish you. You get to protect your peace. You get to prioritize your well-being. You get to be yourself without apology or explanation. So here's what I need from you. Everyone who's made it this far in my story. Everyone who's resonated with any part of what I've shared. First, I need you to understand something crucial. Your story matters. Your experience is valid. Your feelings are legitimate. If you've been told your whole life that you're too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult, I'm here to tell you that you're not. You're having completely appropriate responses to inappropriate situations. Trust yourself. Second, I want you to share your story in the comments below. Have you experienced something similar with family or friends? Have you had to set boundaries that cost you relationships? What did you learn from that experience? How did you find the courage to choose yourself? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to take their first step toward freedom. Third, if this video resonated with you, if any part of my journey touched your heart or gave you hope or made you feel less alone, please hit that like button. It really does help spread this message to other people who need to hear it. Other people who are struggling with the same dynamics I struggled with for so long. Other people who need permission to prioritize their own well-being. Fourth, I want you to subscribe to Living Through It, because this channel is dedicated to sharing real stories about real struggles and real transformations. We're building a community here of people who understand that life is messy and hard and beautiful, who aren't afraid to talk about the difficult stuff, who support each other in choosing authenticity over approval, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story that might be exactly what you need to hear at exactly the right moment. Fifth, and finally, I want you to do something for yourself today. Set one small boundary. Say no to something you don't want to do. Disappoint someone who's been taking advantage of your compliance. Choose yourself in one small way. And notice how it feels. The fear, yes, but also the empowerment, the relief, the sense that you're finally starting to inhabit your own life instead of living for everyone else. Because that feeling, that tiny spark of freedom, is the beginning of everything. It's the crack in the dam that eventually becomes a flood of authenticity and self-respect and genuine joy. You deserve that. You deserve to live your life on your own terms, to be loved for who you are, to make choices that honor your truth even when others disagree. You deserve peace. You deserve boundaries. You deserve to say, that's not your business, to anyone who tries to make your life their property. Thank you for listening to my story, for bearing witness to my journey, for being part of this community where we can be honest about our struggles and our growth. Remember, you're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're absolutely worthy of the life you dream of having. Now go out there and claim it. The world is waiting for the real you.